Good morning. Today is Friday, November 14th. It's currently 10:15 a.m. This is episode 1 because it's not a series of philosophy in lit. Today's topic specifically want to talk a bit about how there is a claim that Murdoch specifically says about how philosophy does not make progress in the same way that we would consider the sciences do, and a bit of a discussion surrounding how that idea sort of came to be and what we would consider philosophy, and sort of what kind of considerations might not be considered philosophy, and sort of the thought process behind why we wouldn't consider it, specifically in relation to possibly intersectionality and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. And I'm Amari, Rideaux. And during this discussion, I really want to shed light on also the literature aspect of Murdoch's views, because she also comments that literature does not make progress either, and that nobody is better than Homer. But I think that could be debated against with the concepts of intersectionality and how that impacts Homer's work, as well as like our view of philosophy and things of that nature.
And my name is Isaac Ramirez. I don't even know, I've been going to college, university for a while. I'm a transfer student, so whatever that makes me.
Yes.
Physics student. So yeah, no, I'm really excited for this one because, when you talk about philosophy and sciences, I think when you say progress, there's just almost consideration of like, what's the nature of asking your questions?
I feel like with that, it's like science is willing to look at different views and philosophy isn't, almost, because she says we haven't left Plato behind. So I feel like with that, she's kind of saying that Plato is something that they can always go back to and kind of always lean on, while science is trying to look forward and, like transcend or progress. But philosophy doesn't necessarily have that willpower.
Yeah, I think it's almost in this essence of like, when I think of philosophy, like one of the key things of philosophy that I've been like thinking about, because it's philosophy and lit, is sort of like the early philosophers must have been, like even before Plato, who we consider the first philosopher, there must have been some philosophers because they have like fables and things like that.
Yes.
So there must have been somebody who was coming up with these and thinking about like the composition of those fables and the sort of the meta-analysis of, and I would consider somebody who does philosophy a philosopher. But what was I at? I was saying something. See, we'll edit this in post.
Exactly. But with that, yes, I feel like Plato is kind of like, from Murdoch's view, it seemed like she uses him like kind of like as the beginning, but even Plato was a student of Socrates. So it's like you can't necessarily say that, we can't move forward when it's like Plato is somebody who was moving forward.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think there's almost the sense of rubbing down the same grindstone, in a sense of like, I feel like philosophy retreads itself a lot of times in its teachings.
Yeah.
Whereas when I think of like things like science, like the courses I take, like you look at something and then you sort of move past it, when I feel like, oh, we're still looking at the same block, as if we haven't internalized that lesson from the block, and so that we must still like look at the block to learn the thing, to internalize it with the same magnitude.
Yeah, I see that, because I feel like when it comes to Plato, it's a lot of like rehashing the same arguments, or kind of just like trying to get your own perspective on the arguments rather than letting it be. Because in science, like when something is a fact, it's kind of just solidified, like you leave it there. But I feel like philosophy, it's a lot of like reworking what has already been done and like going back and breaking it down piece by piece and little by little, which can be helpful, but in some ways it kind of hinders like that progression, and it hinders what philosophy can be and what it can become. I feel like with that like minimal mindset, it's easy for philosophy to be like, it could turn into like a sort of pretentious practice, because sometimes people just use it to like prove their point, or like say what they believe is right and use that as like the end all be all.
I think I'm going to have to disagree with you on specifically the point of science solidifies itself into fact. I think from an outside perspective, that's a really easy kind of conclusion to make. But a lot of the times when you're going into hypothesis and like testing hypothesis, like one of the things they first teach you in something like middle school is your hypothesis will be wrong. And so you have to sort of come to like, okay, you have to be able to look at new evidence and be able to either say my theory is wrong because my evidence is showing it's wrong, or you have to sort of qualify it. And I mean, when we talk about science, there's crazier theories. Like I think like there's technically a theory in science, and it's technically true that you could say the dinosaurs were pink and glittery, but like truly that's probably not the case. But scientifically we can't say that. But we as a consensus, as a group, have said, hey, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, so we've established that fact. And I know like philosophy uses a lot of those same sort of logical chains, because like when you even talk about like Plato, he's like in Socrates, it was a lot of like polymath learning where they were learning all these different subjects. So there was a lot of interconnectedness with that. So you have all those things that sort of chain together. I don't know how we're going to do the sound effects.
No, it's okay. I see the vision. I would say I do agree with that in the way that, like, science doesn't necessarily... Like, you can be wrong when it comes to science, but I feel like... Because, for example, like, in one of my other philosophy classes, we talked about, like, how this philosopher proved that, like, the Earth was flat and, like, it wasn't. Or, like, not the Earth flat. He proved, like, that... Something that, like, the Earth was the center of the universe, and it just, like, that was not true. But because he kind of, like, had that outlook and had all the evidence, it was like, oh, yeah, well, we have to believe that. So I feel like sometimes philosophy can have that type of mindset where it's like, if you have all the points to prove yourself, then we're supposed to just, like, believe you.
Yeah, and I think it also has to do with the idea of something being so difficult to grasp or to get to, because I think you talk about philosophy as a concept. We're getting Derridian here.
Yeah.
Philosophy as a concept, like you have to sort of be really meta about what you're thinking, and as a result of being meta about your thinking, I think there's that internal difficulty that I mean a lot of philosophers talk about. I mean Murdoch mentions the difficulty of being able to recognize your own cognition, but you have to be able to do that, and as a result of, what was I saying? I already lost my train of thought.
It's okay. I see it, though, because I think with that, like, because in Jane Addamson's, like, work against tidiness, she says that, like, philosophy wants to be very, like, prim and proper and, like, very tidy and put together and very uniform. So I feel like I see that in philosophy, but I think philosophy, when it goes out of those bounds, it becomes like a lot more like personal. And even though it's not supposed to be like a practice that is personal, I feel like that kind of brings yourself into it, because I feel like regardless of whether or not we acknowledge it, philosophy is not going to be like digestible unless you personalize it and internalize it.
Yeah, I think there's almost this component of philosophy too that I personally find is cultural. Specifically, I think of like ethics. It's sort of like when I think of, oh, well, why would it be cultural? It's ethics. Where you talk about ethics and you talk about the different sort of standards from time to time. And I think, I mean, even the philosophy we talk about, we like look at different time periods, and there's a conversation about like the cultural context and then the translations of like how we understand that.
Yes.
But there was another point you had made earlier when you were talking about, what was I saying? See, I don't even remember what I said.
It's okay. Stop looking.
Yeah, this is like, I could zone out and think.
No, it's okay. Like,
yeah.
I see it. But I will say that point of like it being cultural, I think that's something that is like really important, because philosophy, even though it's like a concept, it's something that everybody does different. And I think like Murdoch's view of philosophy is very westernized, and like in that view I can't necessarily 100% give it my all, because I do acknowledge that it's like a very Western view of life, and there are so many other views out there that can actually like build on those, or you know, like add more depth to it. And even in that sense, like the text African Philosophy and African Literature by Anthony Kwame Appiah, he was talking about how the differences in Western culture and like African culture is like African culture is a lot more about like finding that sense of community, while like when it relied like the Western view is more so finding identity within yourself. So it's like the self versus like the whole. So I feel like in that sense, like it's just so many conflicting ideas that exist in one practice that it's hard to say that like it's just this one way, or that, you know, Plato is the main man.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Okay, so on the topic of Murdoch saying that, well, you have the other quote, which was about Western. I feel like we've looked a lot about how, specifically in terms of the culture, we've been looking at a lot of Western culture and a lot of like this sort of ideal of like one truth and one reality. And I think there is this component of philosophy that I think is cultural, that sort of, it shapes, like when we look at what we're considering philosophy, we're looking at it shaped by, we're going to bring in Kant because we're just going to use a Kant word, we're going to use maxim, it by like the maxim of the culture that it exists in, because the culture that it exists in sort of already predefines what our standards of morality would be. And so from there you sort of see like, we see it a lot with, I mean, you look at Kant and being like the universal truth of like the truth is all that good, and there's this almost singularness that I mean Nietzsche brings in, and he's like talks about the godlessness, which I think is sort of almost this commentary of like the search for the one truth relates with this sort of religious aspect that is like very westernized. And there's singularness to specifically everything that I think is not quite right. And it's so interesting. It's very interesting to me that even though we're studying philosophy, there's almost this component of we're retreading steps, but in a sense, when we're retreading steps in terms of our understanding, we're doing it almost with the kind of sense of the steps that we are retreading will be the correct ones almost always. Like, I understand we have to go into things with an open mind, because if you don't go into things with an open mind, you're not really going anywhere. You're just kind of staring at things and looking at things, and you're not really making connections.
Yeah, I see that, because I feel like for me, going into philosophy and seeing that it was supposed to be kind of like one thing just doesn't work for me, because like there's not like one idea of truth that's going to exist for everybody, and even one reality is not going to exist for everybody. And I feel like with Plato, like just looking at the Republic, a lot of his views were like, this is that and that's what's true, and it's just like, okay, but we can work around that, or there can be more. And I feel like when he was saying like the imitations, like we shouldn't talk about, you know, things that aren't real, it's like just because it's not real for you doesn't mean it's not real in general.
Yeah, I mean, Plato is really interesting. I struggled reading his work because he writes, if you've ever read any sort of quote style like language or literature, he ironically writes a lot like that, because he presents a lot of leading questions and then he answers himself, which is very annoying to read, because you have to like filter out in your own brain. You have to be like, I'm not agreeing with you, don't make me agree with you when I read your words. It's annoying.
Yes, I feel that too, because when I'm like looking at the text, like I feel like there's some sort of like tone to which it's like, this is what we should do, and this is why we're gonna do it, and this is why it makes sense. And it's like, okay, I see all these things and I'm understanding, I'm looking at your reasons, I don't agree with your reasons, like that's not enough. And so I think with that, it's like I can't go into his work like giving it my all when I know that I don't necessarily like agree with that, or don't necessarily see that as true. And it's kind of just like you have to suppress that, and you have to like digest like what he's saying, and then like kind of just go with it.
Yeah, and it's sort of like he's the hallmark of that lesson when there are, and I understand like when you translate you are shifting it away, but we are saying that is the correct and best way to interpret that lesson that he's trying to impart, even if maybe culturally like we could shift maybe there's like another, I wouldn't say rewriting, but sort of like another writing that entails it. That sort of, which I mean, I guess goes back into like the historical relevance, because you would get into the cultural context of like, well, he was the one, he was the guy.
Yeah, right. But it's also just like what was going on in other places at that time. Like, while I think Plato's very interesting, I think there are so many like views that have existed before him that, or like during him, that's just like kind of hard to see him as like the number one figure. And like, I had even read somewhere that Socrates' like teachers were women, and it's just like things like that, where it's just like, okay, so Plato learned from Socrates, Socrates learned from women. Who did those women learn from? And it's just like all of these like factors, like it's so interesting that there's so much into it, and then we kind of just like, well, let's just look at Plato.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think, like, Plato, he also has really interesting ideas, I mean, when he talks about derivations. An issue for me, like, understanding philosophy sometimes is sort of litmus testing. So it's sort of like, hey, you have an ideology, how can I check that it's wrong? Which is basically logic chains.
Yeah.
You know, like, hey, you've presented me with an idea. Okay, let me test that idea by seeing a concept and seeing if that applies straight. If that doesn't apply straight, I'm missing something. I'm missing something either within that's wrong, or there's a condition that is not being presented here, or my understanding that's wrong, right? And there's this point that Plato makes when he talks about how, because he talks a lot about lies, because he's big on truth and lies, and he talks about the idea of lies diluting something, and that from the premise of lies, you basically just get worse and worse, and there's almost this like descent into worseness that he describes in his work, because if you start at the top and everything gets worse as time goes on, there's no way that you can like get better. Right? And it's sort of interesting that he says that, and it's really interesting that when we read all these philosophers, they kind of have almost the same idea. Like Murdoch saying the greatest philosopher is Plato, and he's the one saying that we're all getting worse from there. Why was saying the greatest works are like the epics, and it's sort of like, why are we so there? And I think there's this almost bubble philosophy likes to exist in, right? Like philosophy has taken so much work to get to the bubble. Why would they want to leave it? And I sort of disagree with some of these ideas. Like I've read fan fiction, and that's the people's literature.
Okay, yes,
that's the people's literature.
Literally that. And I feel like even looking at like the epics, it's just like there's no way that we can say that nobody is better than Homer, or there's no way we can say that literature has not made progress when we see like at first hand all the progress that has been made. So I feel like rather than that being true, it kind of just hinders the progress that we've made as a society. And I feel like you said, philosophy's bubble, that bubble is still so stuck on like a certain viewpoint, and it's very like, even in a way, like it's very like male centered, and it's very like, not to get a little racial, but it's very white in a way too, because it's just like I had seen Plato say that like a man should fear slavery more than death, and it's just like in those aspects, like yes, I understand that, but it's just like what about the slaves that like actually existed like during that time? Like, are they still how should they feel?
What are you saying about them?
Yeah, like what are you saying about them? Because they do exist, you know, like these people are there in your society, and it's kind of just like, well, you should fear being a slave, and it's like, okay, well, you have slaves, so what about them? Like, and so I think in that way, it's just like a lot of like, even in a sense, like I'm not too sure about Plato's like whole, you know, development, but I'm sure he had like some sense of privilege, just being able to sit around a group of men while they talk about like their ideas of building the ideal society. And it's just like a lot of people weren't in that room. A lot of different perspectives didn't get to hear that, or wouldn't have the ability to put their input about what they believe the ideal society should be. And I even seen like they had mentioned something like philosopher kings, and it's just like in those ways, like you don't necessarily, it doesn't seem like you actually think kings are bad. You just want to be in the king position. Like you believe that you deserve that. And so it's just like, in that way, I can't accept like the like kind of like pretentiousness of it, because I just feel like it's kind of like putting certain people on a pedestal when it's like we should be looking at the whole of it all, because there's just so much depth that everybody has that like isn't being acknowledged.
Yeah, there's this almost sense of, I mean, when we read a lot of philosophical works, we're looking at the highs, right? And there's something that I like to think about is that basically most sort of like cultural systems are all prone to corruption, right? When you look at things, they're prone to things going wrong. So instead of designing a system where we should assume that nothing will go wrong ever, we should have built-in systems so that when things go wrong, how can we course correct? And a lot of the sort of texts have been talking about like, it almost feel like you're placing me in optimal conditions. And my question is, what if I'm not in optimal conditions?
Exactly. And I feel like the Republic does that a lot, because he says like we should only be focusing on stories of good. And while I do understand it is important to look at the good a lot, for me personally, looking at stories of bad has been such a great teacher of what not to do. And Adamson even says like a lot of reading is unlearning what you have learned.
Yeah, there's this sense of, I think literature is really good for empathy, but what I think is it's almost, there's this play reel, right? Like it's not the real world, but this play world where we can sort of test our things in a soft way. So when we read things, we're testing our understanding of what somebody has formed from their understanding, and we're testing our own understanding against that, which is in a sense what's always sort of happening, which I think is really nice. That I think Plato says there's only one real understanding, that's kind of what I disagree with. And the sort of cultural interconnectedness of everything. What else can we talk about? I feel like I kind of want to jump another philosopher or something. Or like,
Jump another philosopher.
Jump to another philosopher.
Yeah, I see that. I don't know. Who are you thinking of?
Honestly, I can come for the professor.
Go ahead, yes.
Yeah. Well, because I was just thinking, because I think it was the other day we were talking about Kant, and I had brought up specifically that Kant was, when you talk about, well, was it Kant or it was Hegel, I think, when the clashing of ideas, and then from the clashing of different ideas, you understand it, and sort of this understanding of like, well, through struggle you basically form like like the realization of like what is the ideal. And I disagree with that. I think I had mentioned I disagree with that. My example was bad though, so I talked about quote speeches, right? Cult conversations, which I think when you talk about cult conversations, it's sort of like, well, like there's this almost inherent negative connotation you have to cults, where it's sort of like there's a bad faith actor.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you aren't really in true good faith clashing. But I think it is something to said of, what do you do when you have 4 people and you're working on, for example, like a math problem, and nobody knows what to do, so you guys all kind of come together and you all have different ideas, and maybe you come up with an answer and it could be worse than what any one of you had did, because all of you had different ideas about what was coming on, and sort of you guys challenged each other and you guys went in the wrong direction, right? Because it could be that everybody in a room knows it and one person knows the actual answer but everybody else doesn't, and in those clashing ideas you actually get further from the truth instead of closer, which I think I presented that as like a conditional. And there was this almost sense of, well, that's like an equation. And I was like, wait. And I do want to talk about that, because that wasn't an equation.
Yeah.
That was a logic chain.
Right.
And so when we talk about like logic chains and equations, and I even think like math is a language in a weird way.
I see it.
Math is like a weird language. Like when I do my physics classes and they're describing, well, how can I, a lot of times we're like, okay, we're saying this is a thing. How do we say that numerically? And like, how can we relate, like, hey, if I throw a ball, can you describe throwing a ball? And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm just using numbers.
Yes, I see. Because even in like logic, like they give you like the numbers and then you build that into like a whole sentence kind of.
Yeah.
So I see kind kind of like the interconnectedness of it. And I feel like in that interconnectedness, I feel like that's kind of something that goes back to philosophy, because even though philosophy says it's like very small, philosophy extends itself almost into like everything if you're willing to see it there.
So this is where we're going to jump Murdoch. Because
Yes.
Murdoch says specifically that bad philosophy isn't philosophy, right? But I actually want to examine specifically by what Murdoch says is philosophy, because Murdoch talks a lot about what like they consider art, right? And I think anything really could be considered philosophy. I take a really dirty intake in which you examine, well, where does philosophy start from? Like in the context of existence of philosophy, where is that? And I think that's mostly internal, right? Like, I think philosophy starts from the understanding of something. So I think really there is no way that there is nothing that I can think of off the top of my head that would disqualify that from being like able to spark a thought about something.
I get that. I feel like in that way, I might disagree a little, just because I feel like philosophy, even though it doesn't have like an exact start, I feel like if you extend it into like things like religion, there are like certain religions like Hinduism and Buddhism that like take their own idea of philosophy, and I feel like with that kind of idea of philosophy, they live life through that. And so I feel like in those ways, like I don't even know if monks like would be considered philosophers, but like for me, like I think of like monks and how they dedicate their whole lives to like finding that sense of peace and finding like what they believe is like the epitome of being like at peace and like being comfortable in oneself. And so I feel like some of those like philosophies can be so internalized that like there is kind of like a beginning of it, just because it seems like certain people start that like practice and then others are able to go into it. So I feel like even though philosophy is like a concept that's out there, I think like there's like I do see like the formulation of philosophy as something that you live by, you know, because if you live by that, then that kind of like origin of it is true. Because like even like for like Kant and like Nietzsche, like they have their own philosophies that they live by. So like I feel like in that way there is a start, you know?
Yeah. I think there are certainly things that I will condition my statement, but there are things that are more prone to be to help you engage in philosophy. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm looking at a table, chances are I'm probably not thinking about philosophy when I look at a table. It's not going to prompt my mind. But I could see a table and think about how there are grooves on the table and how that sort of relates to how the structure of maybe a text or the environment I'm like thinking about, and sort of how that sort of thought process interconnects, and sort of like analyzing, well, when I change the table, how does that, if it's a metaphor for my relations and I'm using that when I look at this, then how does that change in my brain everything? And in that sense, it's sort of like, well, then the table is philosophy, I guess.
Sure. Because, I see. Because I think philosophy, for me, is like something that you apply to something. So I do see that like the table could be philosophy for somebody, because when you apply that to the table, it becomes your own type of philosophy. So that's why I also see like that start, you know, like it gets started and then you make it into something. So I think that's something that like it should be considered, that like philosophy is not just like Plato and Socrates like sitting around in a group. Like this is something that like sparks from like kind of that inner like turmoil, and then you like make that into reality.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about when you talk about philosophy, specifically like, because I remember Murdoch saying bad philosophy isn't philosophy, so it becomes a question also of like, well, if bad philosophy isn't philosophy, what do we consider bad?
Right.
And I think that's where we start getting into like almost censorship, and because we're American, I understand censorship is scary. I mean censorship softly and sort of dissuading and sort of pushing things away, not completely saying no and we should burn the books, but censorship's in a softer way.
I will say I'm not too sure about the censorship aspect of it all, because I do think there are certain texts that should be like, you know, we should have certain like views that like are analyzed more, because certain books, they can't, if it's just like bad topics, then it's kind of just like, what is the point here? Like, what is the benefit of it, you know?
I agree. I agree 100%. When I think
Yes.
about censorship, I mean, there's of course the ideas of the books burning and the books banning that I think is really bad. But there's almost this sense of when you talk about things of like conversations of a bad nature, I'm gonna bring in Plato because if you were, Plato's questions are very leading, right? And Plato is a good work, but if I were to apply his sort of format or his structure to something else, then I'm not quite sure like that's the correct way that we should look through that.
So do you think like Plato should be censored?
I mean, do I think Plato should be censored? I think yeah, actually. I think I don't like the way he formed like the way it's written, like the format is it's not conducive to learning his idea. It's almost too conducive to learning his ideas and not conducive to learning ideas, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. Funny enough, I'm on the fence because I do think Plato is just like very insistent. Like what he's saying is like, hey, like believe it. But I feel like also in a way it is, as a writer, it's enjoyable to look at something that I don't agree with and see why I don't agree with it. I feel like Plato has helped me see that like some of the views that I've had before aren't necessarily like wrong, and that like sometimes I can build off them, because I feel like even though Murdoch is easy to jump, like when I there was a text like The Fire and the Sun, like Plato's banishing the poets or whatever, and she was commenting on how she felt like Plato like feared like the literary like poet in himself, and like that piece of himself that was able to express art. And I feel like that shows, because even in the Republic, like he acknowledges that, like, you know, I don't want Homer and the poets to be mad at me for this, but this is like for the greater good. And it's just like, you know, that like these texts or like these things have the ability to make you feel so much, but you want to suppress that. And so like in that way, like I'm interested in that like suppression, and I'm interested in like the kind of idea that like, I guess his idea of censorship, because like I don't agree with it, but I think it's something that it forms a lot of like modern day questions, like in a lot of modern day like applications that make sense.
Yeah. What I will say when I talk about censorship is I sort of came to the conclusion of like censorship I don't think should be banned, but sort of like tagged and analyzed further. It's like you just like, I think of, we're gonna bring the fan fiction back. I think of AO3 tags, which if you're unaware of AO3 tags, are absolutely ridiculous, and like they span so much. So you look at it and it's an extremely like categorical sense of like, hey, if I need to filter through something, I can put in whatever words, and there's probably something that exists for any sort of, not even like a keyword, it could just be like a loose word, you know what I mean, like an unkeyword. So when I think of that, I think of it like sort of like a tag of like, hey, read this, but read it with caution. You know what I mean? Like read this, but read it with the understanding that you will have to analyze this further. This is a conversation that lends itself to being very pushy. So when I read other works, they don't feel as pushy to me.
Yeah. Funny enough, a lot of people would say that AO3 needs to get censored though, because like there are certain, and that's why like, I don't know, I think it's a very sticky situation, because I feel like even though like as Americans we'd be like censorship is crazy, but like we literally have banned books lists, so there are like levels of censorship. And even like not to get too like educational, but like even in like the education system, like in Oklahoma, like they want the kids to like read the Bible like as part of their curriculum. So it's like in those ways like there's certain censorship that goes into play. And so I feel like with Plato, he has like his broad ideas of censorship, and we've picked up on like his little tidbits almost.
Yeah, like we've definitely refined his censorship to mean certain things that we apply. But yeah, no, I definitely feel like, I mean, even when you talk about like context of like censorship, that's the word. Concept of, well, actually, you know what? No. We'll just edit that part out. But I want to switch tracks to specifically AO3, and I think those tags are sort of, it changes the structure from the book itself, or the writing itself. The structure that you're going to is designed to censor it as opposed to a self-censorship sort of form, because you have filters and you have tags. So if you have filters and you have tags, and things are filtered and things are tagged, then I can just not see what I don't want to see.
Yeah, and in that way, that's like a form of like self-censorship
It's a
almost,
form of,
like,
yeah.
because I do agree with like that, because even on AO3 there's some things I don't want to see, so I feel like with that it gives you the ability to like take hold and like dictate what you do and don't want to engage in. And kind of funny enough, I know this isn't like fan fiction, but I think the essays like Homer's Daughter by, I don't even know how to say her last name, but I know
We'll
it's
try.
Fiona Cox and Alina Theodora Kapalis. And so basically they say a lot of like, they go over a lot of works that rework like Homer's the Iliad, and
Yeah.
like kind of give voices like to those women in the books. So like for me, that's kind of like modern day fan fiction, or even like Toni Morrison's Desdemona, because I did read that, and so like that feels like, you know, like a way of fan ficting like Shakespeare. So I feel like in those ways, like that's a clear example of one, progression, and two, just like the way that we can like personalize those things and kind of work through them to make them more like applicable to modern day, or even to make them stick out to you more.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I only bring up because I feel like their existence of fan fiction as a concept has this sort of cultural stigmatism.
Yeah.
There's definitely a strong cultural stigmatism for fan fiction, which is why I bring up the term fan fiction when you bring up like derivative works. You're like, well, actually, you can just apply that. It's like Desdemona is very much that, and it's a very good way of being. It is a way to be meta about what you're reading. Interestingly enough, which is sort of like you can take a work and you can analyze it to expand upon or sort of change something.
Yeah, for me, I feel like those like derivatives are like a way to like kind of destigmatize like fan fiction, because even though people wouldn't say like this is fan fiction, I feel like taking a work and like rewriting it to your own kind of even like OC standards, because Desdemona did not act like how she acted like in the Shakespeare in Othello. So with that, it's like you see the way they internalize those things and create a whole new reality of the text. And like I think that's very interesting in a way to like broaden the sense, you know?
Yeah, I will say I really liked about Desdemona is there's this intersectionality between the philosophies, and even though within there's this almost cultural standard for the ideal that they live by, which is like standing by their husband no matter what, there is this sort of difference in how they get there that I really appreciate about the interconnectedness of it all, which sort of just I think it shows sort of that philosophy itself is not really linear in the sense of it's focusing on a thing, like a singular focal point, and it's diverse in which you may get to the same point through there, but I think also to analyze it, you can't just look at, well, they went to the same point going forward, because I think you should be able to analyze philosophy also going backwards.
Right.
And so being able to go backwards and look at them diverge, I think is also a very thing of like, well, you can't say that that's the direction forward, because the direction backward just is spread. So
Yeah, I see that. And I feel like for philosophy, like in a way it's like it tries to be one thing and it falls into everything. And so with that, like kind of just taking back to literature, I feel like philosophy that engages with literature becomes so much more like understanding. And even though Murdoch had even said like she doesn't consider like Nietzsche like a philosopher and rather like a writer, in those ways it's just like again trying to like narrow the scope of what philosophy is, when so many people have probably like been more engaged in philosophy when reading Nietzsche than anybody else. So it's like there are certain standards that like can bring that out of you and make you more like willing to interact with it. And I feel like when philosophy becomes that one thing, or becomes that like just a field of study, like it just becomes something that people aren't able to connect with almost. And I know that even becomes a problem, because it's like, who wants to connect, and like empathy, is that real? It's like, okay, let's just like take for a moment and like actually think about the way that like you're affected by some readings. Like even though Plato isn't supposed to be like somebody that's like literary, when you read Plato you feel either good or bad, because like when you read it, like you're either going to be like, yeah, this makes sense, or like, no, this doesn't make sense. So even in that way, philosophy can't help but like elicit those emotions. So I think it's interesting that like we kind of have like this one way of looking at it, and then like it just bleeds into everything.
Yeah, and I do want to say when we talk about philosophy being singular, I think it's also the question of by whose standards, right? Because I could write something, right, and the interpretation of my writing could be different. I mean, we see that with translators, whatever they're interpreting, as translations from A to B to C, why we get different translations when we look at the Iliad or the Odyssey, or, I mean, pretty much most of the philosophers, because a good chunk of the philosophers that we've been reading did not write in English.
Yeah.
I mean, Weil was French, Nietzsche was, I think, German. I don't know, I just know he was not English.
He's German, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, he was
but
German?
See, yeah, so like with those points, like even translations are like a point of progress. Like that's something that shows philosophy is growing because more people are able to digest it and it becomes something that is more widespread.
Yeah, and I think because I want to make the point of, because Murdoch said that it was singular, right, that when you have these different interpretations, you cannot say that it is singular because the different interpretations have slight nuances, and with those nuances you can't define them as the same, because to define them as the same would be to basically say, well, if you're saying that every single one is the same, then if I derive from a derivation of a derivation and so on and so forth, eventually I should still get the same product, but I'm not getting the same product. I'd get something very different. So if I'm getting something different, they all have to be different. So philosophy in itself cannot be singular. And I think it also goes back to Murdoch's statement of that philosophy has a limited set of questions that it can answer, which I disagree with. I think there's an infinite possibility of questions. I think that, however, a lot of your situations in which your answers might be very similar. However, the context of which anything might happen is always changing and always different. And so we should recognize that that context is changing and shifting. And so while you might still get the same answer for more than a dozen questions, you should still acknowledge, hey, technically these questions are different.
Yeah, and in a way, I feel like she's sort of putting that on it, because like even though you say philosophy can only answer a certain amount of questions, that doesn't make it true. And I feel like with that mindset, it makes certain people go into that with that belief, and so it becomes like the standard for it.
It's this resistant to shift sort of stance, which it's just, I mean, like, you see it bleeding in all the way from Homer. I mean, Weil has a similar thing, and it feels like some of the readers that some of the philosophers and writers that we've been reading from have sort of had this resistance to change. I mean, Weil even talks about how the greatest of works is like the Iliad and Homer, and that those epics cannot surpass. And I think there's just that. I don't disagree with it. I just disagree with that.
Yeah, and it's just like a very narrow mindset almost, because while I do like Weil's work, because I did write an essay about it, and I do see that like the Iliad is something that has a lot of like humanity in it, but even in that sense, like the way that philosophy isn't very like open to understanding the way that like literature can move people, or not really like maybe not even like believing in empathy. So it's like in those ways, like it still feels like we're trying to keep this like small and in one viewpoint. And it's like if I'm reading the Iliad and I'm feeling like these empathetic like moments of force that take a hold of me and actually give me that type of like understanding, or actually make me engaged in the text, like there's no way that we can say it's just this one thing. But in another sense for philosophy, I just feel like I low-key lost my train of thought. But
okay. I can touch on the nuance if you want to.
Yes.
Because I actually wanted to talk about the Mars Room. I actually really enjoyed the Mars Room, the reading of it. And what I loved about it was a really good example of how, I think it was a really good example of like that absolutism, sort of like that Kant ideology, doesn't really work in a large structure, because a lot of it is about how you examine the lives through these different people engaging with the prison system, most notably the prisoners, and then a person who works at the prison, a teacher who is not part of the structure itself, but is sort of coming into the structure. And you see the way that this sort of absolutism, where this rules, or this pre-established assigned structure, does not accommodate to them, and how they are sort of clashing against it. I mean, it's the book was supposed to be named by Nietzsche, and I think in German it was, but it was American, it wasn't. Which I think Nietzsche's whole point about good and evil, and how you cannot sort of inflict change without being evil, which I think we conflate typically being evil with being bad, right? So it would be like you must do bad to then do good, which I think is sort of like, well, you must engage in bad philosophy to do good philosophy. In a weird way, right? Because your bad philosophy must not adhere to your good philosophy.
I feel it. I feel like with the Mars room, that is like sort of an example of like the intersectionality that philosophy can miss sometimes. And I feel something that stuck out to me when looking at Nietzsche was him saying that like we create these ideas of other worlds to ignore the one true world, or like the one world that we live in. And while I do think there are so many like perspectives and realities that people like go into the world with, I do understand that like certain systems that we have in our world can't like be ignored, like this prison system. And so I feel like with the prison system being something that we look at kind of just like in doses, a lot of people don't really care about prisoners. A lot of people don't really care about like the systems or like kind of the things that go in place to make them go to prison almost, or like
the system of oppression that exists in the wider context.
Exactly. So so those things, like those automatically have an impact on like the people who are in prison. And it's not to say that people in prison like just need all the sympathy in the world, but there is an acknowledgement that we live in a society that kind of relies on the prison system, and kind of just like once you're in the prison system you get wrote off. There's not a lot of like support or even recognition of what took them to get to that point. And I feel like we see that in philosophy, like a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but like kind of with the Murdochian view of philosophy, it kind of becomes that like we just have like this one point. Like Plato, he's not going to think about the prisoners. That's why he says you should fear slavery, but he doesn't think about the slaves.
Yeah. No. I'm just thinking, are there any other points we want to hit? I feel like we've hit a lot of good points.
Honestly, I feel like we've done a lot. Yeah. Like, this is good. This is very productive. For
like an hour.
Low-key, and I'm like, yay. And then we have 10 minutes before this, so I think we're pretty good.
Okay, for sure. Okay.
How do we wrap this up?
Okay, let's
I'm like, is there an example?
Probably. If we just scroll at the bottom. No, I think they just say things.
Okay. Well, I would say this has been a very productive talk. I appreciate your perspective.
Yeah, no, I have really enjoyed the conversation. It's been engaging.
It's gone on longer than we even expected, so thank you so much.
Yeah, no, same to you.
Shout out to Mr. Hatton. Thank you.
Thank you for having us do this.
Exactly. Literature and philosophy.
It's fun.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is great. I think we're good. Have a great day. Like, do I tell the people on here to have a good day?
I think so. It's 11:05 a.m. right now, so have a good morning.
Have a great morning. Enjoy this conversation.